What's good, everybody? This is the man with the plan, Gen X of Gen X Comics, and I am excited to bring you another amazing episode of the Gen X Show. Thank you all for coming through and supporting us. And remember your homework. Make sure that you like, subscribe, and share to everyone, to anyone, and anyone who's a geek like us. So we're so excited. And I started this podcast as a labor of love. I've been collecting for decades, and just this is also part of my my wish was during the pandemic to make sure that we stay connected. So without further ado, I'm excited to bring on the stream. I am joined today by Julio Anta. He's a writer of many graphic novels, including the Eisner Award nominated Frontera, the Blue Bonnet Award nominated Speak Up Santiago, This Land is Our Land, a Blue Beetle story, Home, and Si Se Puede, the Latino heroes who changed the United States. And Julio was born and raised in Miami, Florida, and currently resides in New York City. Forthcoming work includes a slate of graphic novels for Harbor Alley, Random House Graphic, and First Second. And beyond creator-owned projects, Julio has contributed to acclaimed anthologies and collaborations with studios and independent publishers, bringing his signature voice to diverse genres, from superheroes to superhero epics to horror-infused magical realism. His scripts have earned recognition for inventive world building, sharp dialogue, and commitment to reflective, inclusive storytelling that honors Puerto Rican heritage. So if you can handle it, there's going to be two Boricuas on the stream. And unfortunately, his co-conspirator, who's also unfortunately could not make it, Daniel Irizarri, is also Boricua. So you all will get a taste, and you probably might hear some back and forth, and maybe in our native tongue. So I'm going to bring Julio. Julio, how are you?
Hello, I'm good. I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here. I do have one quick correction. I'm
Yes.
not Boricua, I'm Cuban.
Okay,
But,
my bad, my bad.
we're close enough. They say we're wings of the same bird, right?
That's right. That's right. We're cousins for sure. I mean, we
Yeah.
we have the same flag, just inverted colors. There's
Oh,
always
yeah.
been a storied
Yeah.
history with us. So I stand corrected, and I thank you for correcting that. And I
Yeah.
appreciate you putting so much energy and effort into the Caribbean culture. It's just amazing book.
Thank you.
I will tell you, I pre-ordered all five issues already.
We
So thank
love to hear.
we're going to talk about Beast of Borikén, which is the five-part issue miniseries. It's contemporary of Puerto Rico, Loli Flores. She's a fierce activist fighting the overdevelopment of the island by outside investors. And if you didn't see anything about what's going on in Puerto Rico, this is exactly the conversation piece that we need to have. And this groundbreaking part of the book is there's a groundbreaking ceremony is violently interrupted by a supernatural force, and Loli discovers that the stories of a Chupacabra are not just echoes from the past, but a brutal protector of generations extending back to the indigenous people of the island. And as Loli uncovers the horrors firsthand, that Chupacabra is on a parallel path with the elemental destruction left in his wake. So I'm excited to learn more and hear more. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your origin story? And give us a little glimpse of where you grew up, and we'll jump into why this is important, why this book is important.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I grew up in Miami, born and raised. I live in New York now. Um, my dad's side of the family's Cuban. My mom's side is Colombian. So a pretty toxic mix. Uh, but I grew up in a place that is 70% Latino, right? It is a place where Spanish is my first language. You walk into a store, you're greeted in Spanish, you're surrounded by Latino culture. It's a place where I never felt marginalized in any way. But despite all of that, I never really saw myself in any of the comics that I grew up reading, that I grew up loving. If I wanted to see myself, I had to watch one of the novelas that my grandma watched, or I had to put on Telemundo, Univision. But in American culture, I never saw myself, but I loved comics, I loved manga, I loved anime. So when I was a kid, I started making comics. Just like me and my brother, we would draw them, we would distribute them to our friends and family, and then eventually, I decided that I wanted to try to I was an adult and still reading comics a lot, and I decided I wanted to make my own comics, and what really was the impetus for that, was my first book called Home. Uh, I learned how to write comics, I learned how the industry worked, all in service of making Home. And that all happened because of the 2018 family separation crisis at the border. Like a lot of people, I was watching what was happening on TV, on my phone, on the internet, and I was just horrified by what I was seeing. I was seeing children, young children that reminded me of my son. My son was 3 years old at the time, um, that were just being violently ripped away from their parents and sent off to you know, centers all over the country. Families have no idea where their kids are being sent to. And I felt helpless and I was angry and I wanted to sort of channel that anger into something positive, into something creative, into something where I can share my point of view. And that's why I made Home. So like a lot of people who make comics, I started off with mini comics first. I started making 4 to 10 page stories about, different things that I was passionate about. I made my first mini comic was about a Mexican American ICE agent who just can't take the brutality of his work anymore. And I made another story about a father who uh, imagines what it would be like if if his son was killed by a cop, just like he keeps seeing over and over again on the TV, and what he would do in that situation. So I started just making these stories that were about things that I was passionate about with my unique point of view, as a way to learn how to write comics and as a way to kind of break into the industry a little bit and start making friends and meeting people, meeting editors. And then I pitched my book Home, which was a 5 issue miniseries. Luckily, it landed at Image. We got to do something that I thought was really special with that book, and ever since then, I've kept making books. I've mostly made graphic novels, for young adults, for middle grade, and periodically I've written short stories. I've gotten to work with Marvel, with DC. I did a Blue Beetle graphic novel. But now is my first time, 5 years later, really properly returning to the direct market with a new single issue series with Bisa Borikén. So I'm super excited. I think it's a really special book. I'm really lucky to be working with Daniel, who's an incredible Boricua cartoonist. Just making something that we're both really passionate about and that we both really care. And yeah, I'm excited for everyone else to
Awesome.
read it.
Yeah, I am too. I think I'm going to be honest with you. I was really enthralled by the subject matter. One, because I'm Puerto Rican. I'm New Yorican. I should say that.
Yeah.
I don't want to upset any of my folks from the motherland who were born there. But the reality is that we are all united in this conversation, and so I appreciate your steadfast focus on the social justice issues that may or may not be visible and or
Mhm.
present in this current time. But I applaud you. That it's just a different take, and I'm glad that you found some publishers that really were brave enough, or even um, were forward thinking and
Mhm.
understanding that we have to diversify what we have. So when you grew up in Miami, you didn't see people that look like you. You didn't see any stories or comic books. What did you lean into? Like, what did obviously you created your own stuff and your own eventual stories, but what is it that you leaned into that really kept you into the space of comic book creation?
Yeah, I mean, I was super into manga and anime, like I'll never forget the first day that I like stumbled. My dad was gonna go see a chiropractor in this strip mall, and I was just wandering around and I found this store called Anime Hurricane. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was an anime store. And they had the big wall scrolls hanging from the window. They had walls of like fan subbed VHS tapes, like bootleg fan sub, that was like dubbed or like subtitled by the guy in like the back room of the anime store, Miami Mike. That was his tag on all the videos when you'd watch them. But like, I was watching Dragon Ball GT when Dragon Ball Z was only out in the US. I was watching arcs of Naruto that were so like really years ahead. And then I also discovered their superhero comics because they had a wall of direct market comics. And to sort of like uh, to date when I first started getting into superhero comics, it was Marvel Civil War, that event. Issue 1 was the first issue I picked up that was like a proper superhero comic that, nobody else bought for me, or wasn't like a random issue that I got at the drugstore or something. It was like the first time that I was reading, like, this is the start of a big story, you know?
Mhm.
So, I fell in love, even though manga was really like is probably my biggest touch point in my like comic reading journey. But like I got into superhero comics as well. Um, and I just kept reading, like I kept reading Image books as I got older. I kept reading Walking Dead was one of the books that like I read the whole run of, from the time that I first discovered it, like maybe around like issue 80, and then I was monthly through the end.
Wow.
And then just keep discovering new books. And as you get older and like you start having a little bit of money and you're not like dirt poor and like struggling, you can afford to go to the comic book shop, and that's what I was doing. But yeah, and then I think like a lot of people who read comics, you start thinking like, I could probably write this. Um, it was more difficult than I expected. But I realized that there wasn't anybody I had an interest in certain types of stories that did not exist in the US comic book market. And that's part of what really inspired me to start writing my own stories, because there were these books that if I could pick them up and buy them, I would just read them. There wouldn't be any need for me to write them. And because I don't think I'm a particularly, unique person, or, I think there's a lot of other people like me who would also like to read the kinds of stories that I wish existed in the comic books market. And I think, the time that I've been in the industry now, which is about 5 years, I think that's kind of proven that thesis that there are people that want to read these stories that are extremely grounded, and that do have a political point of view, because most of us do have political point of views, regardless as to, how, um, you know, what level of consciousness or political consciousness we each have. I my favorite books are the ones where I'm learning something new in it. It's a great story that could stand on its own, but I'm also learning new things in it, and I'm reading about new experiences that are foreign to me. So that's kind of what I've tried to do with my books too.
Do you want to talk about how, the beast of Borinken and the folklore of the Chupacabra came about, and why? For those who don't know what a
Yeah.
Chupacabra is, the
Yeah.
mythical
Well,
creature.
yeah, I mean, chupacabra means goat sucker. It is a in the world of cryptids, it's not very old. The first use of the phrase chupacabra is in like 1995. But we can trace it back further to like 1975, of these rumors of a creature called El Vampiro de Moca, the vampire
Mm,
of Moca, small town in Puerto Rico. But yeah, like I grew up in the 90s, and grew up watching all these like tabloid news shows with my grandma, Primer Impacto, like the chupacabra was everywhere.
yep.
It started in Puerto Rico, then it spread to, Guatemala, El Salvador, obviously Mexico, and the American Southwest. Like, there's all these news reports, interviews with people of like who saw it. It turns from like, a sort of like alien, like, two-legged creature to like a dog-like creature, depending on what region of Latin America you find it in. And I was always just fascinated by that as a kid. So I feel like it was like ever present in my life. And then with this book, like what it's really about is the, ongoing 500 plus year colonialism of the island, whether it was with the Spanish invasion in 1493, or it was with the US invasion after the Spanish or during the Spanish American War, or now
Mhm,
this new sort of like neo-colonialism when it comes to these real estate developers and these people that are just bringing a new form of exploitation to the island. In the past, it might have been, sugarcane, or it might have been all these sort of like natural resources, goods that you could export out of the island. And now it's literally taking land and
mhm,
making Puerto Rico a place that is unaffordable to Puerto Ricans. As you're a New Rican, the majority of Puerto Ricans don't live on the island anymore. They live in the mainland.
Yeah.
So this is an experience that so many Puerto Ricans have had to live through, and that there's so many Puerto Ricans on the island that are currently struggling against these sorts of real estate developments that we explore in the book. Our main antagonist is a real estate developer, but this is based off of, like all my books, like Home, right? It
Mhm.
is based on real events. It's all grounded, but there's one thing that's a little bit different. There's one supernatural element, and in this case, it's the chupacabras, right? And who is this creature that is this inhuman creature who, when he encounters Loli, encounters humanity for the first time in centuries, you
Mm.
know, um, and is really also the embodiment of the trauma, the struggle that the Puerto Rican people have experienced over the last 500 years, but manifested in this monstrous, primitive rage that I think a lot of people have all over the world, all colonized people. But this is so there's that aspect of it, right? There's like a very pointed political aspect to it. But it's also just like a gory tropical horror comic book story that is, like a fun political revenge thriller.
Yeah. I laughed because you said horror, bloody, fun
Yeah.
was like the
Yeah.
third, and I love it. I think that that there is a lot of the messaging that you're putting there visually and in the script and in the writing that allows people to pull what they need from it and to educate themselves even further, because what you just described is obviously the colonization of an island for over
Mhm.
500 years, and that it has morphed into similar things of basically exploitation, like you said. But now we're starting to see it really have a ripple effect in the sense of the exploitation, whether it's in health and education
Mhm.
or even just the viability for the island of Puerto Rico to actually stand on its own feet. uh,
Mhm.
but you also talk about the resiliency of the people and where that comes from,
Mhm.
the history. Tell me a little bit about Loli.
Oli will be a very familiar character to people who are involved in like activism and movement circles. She's a person that is driven by rage. You could say she's addicted to anger, because so many of us, everywhere that we look, we can find things to be, outraged about every single day, right? She is someone who was 17 years old during Hurricane Maria. So she survived Hurricane Maria, had great personal losses in her life due to the hurricane, and I think came to understand that Hurricane Maria was not just a natural disaster. There's the natural disaster component to it, but there's also the man-made disaster component that stems from many years of neglect, many years of privatization of, important resources like the electrical grid. And then after the natural disaster, also the man-made disaster of negligence
Mhm.
towards the people. So she lived through all of that, right? She experienced all that. She's traumatized by all of that and her losses. Um, and she's radicalized by that in the sense that it opened up her mind, it gave her a new consciousness that now drives her to activism and to making a change in her community. She couldn't control the hurricane, she couldn't control the personal losses that she experienced because of the hurricane. But now that there's this, what she understands as an exploitation, a theft of Puerto Rican land, she feels like she can do something about that. And she will do something about that. And when she comes face to face with this chupacabras, they will see each other. Quite literally, they will see each other in each other's eyes, and they'll come to understand that their struggle is the same struggle. One of them might be driven by this like primitive rage, and another one is driven by this like deeply human emotions, but they're both two sides of the same coin.
Wow, you are deep, brother. I'm cannot wait to read this because I totally connect with that, to tap into the rage and also
Mhm.
have the humanity piece balance or try to balance each other out, but there's no need to balance sometimes because the occasion will allow you to step into that space
Mhm.
of heroics, that space of like activism, the space
Yeah.
of just basically correcting it. And right now, as folks may or may not know, the island that's supposed to be protected across and public for everyone is now
Mhm.
being sold off to the highest bidder. And I spoke to one of my favorite folks. I call him my pseudo uncle, Felipe Luciano, who was
Oh,
part of the
yeah.
Young Lords Party, and
Of course.
he said,
You see what's behind me right here? Oh, wait, other
"Yeah,
side. I'm
yep,
mirrored. Yeah,
yep,
Young Lords.
yep." He is. I call him my uncle just because I aspired to be like him. I
Mhm.
love the fact that he was able to do a lot here, specifically in New York as the president,
Mhm.
but to hear the stories. He goes back to Puerto Rico and he does a lot of introspection, does a lot of analysis, and brings it back
Mhm.
to the states. But one of the things that he talks about is that we all need to collectively pull our resources together, our monies together, and buy back Puerto Rico and come back,
Mhm.
physically come back. Um, and I hope that that kind of resonates with folks.
It's a colony of the
Yeah,
United States, and like all colonies, it is a place where resources are extracted from the colony and
yeah,
sent to the mainland. It exists to be exploited, and as long as it remains a colony of the United States, that's what it will be. It'll be exploited.
yeah.
But I think the interest in this book comes from a lot of places. I think a lot of people, whether it's because, and this is not going to sound silly to you. I think it sounds silly to a lot of people. But Bad Bunny is playing a huge role in opening the consciousness of people towards Puerto Rico to understand the struggles of Puerto Rico. And I think, there's also, there's so much happening in the world that we see how they're all interconnected, whether it's the genocide in Palestine, whether
Mhm.
it's Puerto Rico, whether
Mhm.
it's this assault on Cuba.
Yep,
All of these things are of a same piece. It's all colonialism, in a sense. And it's all just like imperial control over a people who just
mhm,
want self-determination,
mhm.
so yeah, I mean, Felipe Luciano is, and the Young Lords are a huge, influence and a huge part of, my sort of like political awakening. And I'm also, I don't know if you know this, but it's not coming out for a few years. The artist just started drawing it. But I co-wrote a graphic novel with Juan Gonzalez, one of the
Yes,
co-founders of the Young Lords.
yes,
And that was an amazing experience. And I can't wait for people to read it. And obviously Felipe Luciano plays a huge role in that story. And I'm curious to see what he thinks about it when it comes out.
yeah. Well, we'll have to bring them on. Maybe we'll pull all of us together. I actually, funny enough, Juan Gonzalez's daughter was actually
Mhm.
my intern where I work at my 9 to 5, and I
Whoa.
came into my office one year, and I said to her, "Hey, I found this great book. I think you would love it." And she goes, "Well, who wrote it?" And I said, "Juan Gonzalez." She goes, "That's my dad." So I ended up. It was a funny interaction, but in my other podcast that I have called Limbo Latino, I actually
Mhm.
interviewed both of them at the same time, and it was such an
Whoa.
interesting conversation around generational activism and how does that
Yeah,
play out
I'd have to
from
listen to
two
that.
different.
That's great.
Yeah,
Was it Harvest of Empire? Was that the book you tried to give her?
yeah, Harvest of
Yeah,
Empire.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. Harvest of
um,
Empire is one of those I kinda credit 2 books with, like, truly changing my life. The first one was A People's History of the United States. I think, like, a
yeah,
lot of people, maybe I don't know if you watch The Sopranos, but, there's that scene where, Tony Soprano's son, AJ, reads it, and he's reading the first pages about
yep,
Christopher Columbus, and it starts this whole debate. So I
yep,
think that, that book has done a lot for a lot of people. But then the second one was Harvest of Empire.
yeah,
It's a book that helped me understand, what are the circumstances that led to us being here in the
mhm,
United States, and how it all leads to US intervention in our homelands. And I think Juan just did like an amazing job on that book. And getting to work with him was like, a once in a lifetime opportunity.
I wanted to show folks a little bit about your work. Here's a little bit of the Beast of Borinken. These are the covers for um, the first book, right? Is that
Yeah,
these are
first two
all variant
issues.
covers, the first two issues.
Yeah, so the one on the two on the one on the left and the second to the left, those are both by Daniel. Those are the first one is cover A for issue 1, and then cover B for issue 2. Daniel is the Irizarri, he's the artist on the book. So he drew both of those, and then the other 3 are variant covers. But yeah,
Yeah,
I mean they're all beautiful covers. We
they're
have
gorgeous.
we have more beautiful covers coming. I feel, so lucky and like, it's amazing.
Hey, I got on the bandwagon a little early, but can you tell people how they can get all 5 issues pre-ordered
Yeah,
and
yeah.
signed and all that stuff? Where can people get it?
Yeah, well, it's published by Dark Horse Comics and Tiny Onion, so you can get it wherever you buy comics. So you can go to your comic shop, add it to your pull list, pre-order it. I'm not sure when this interview is going to go up, but FOC for issue 1 is Memorial Day, May 25th. But we're also doing. I've partnered with one of my local shops here in New York. It's a shop in Brooklyn called Anyone Comics. So if you go to their website, you can pre-order all 5 issues. They'll ship when the final issue comes out. So I think that's important. I don't want people to be disappointed and think that they're going to get them as they come out. But once the final issue comes out, I'm going to go to the shop. I'm going to sign them all, and then they'll all 5 issues will ship to you. But it's all at cover price, so it's $25 plus shipping. And
Can't
it's a
beat
great
that.
shop. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And support your LCSs. They are suffering, but hopefully they're making money at the advent. Currently, I think we're at a new renaissance for especially comic books and indie comics in particular. So make sure you support them. So you talked about your collaboration. What was that like with your partners in crime, basically, for this book? What was it?
Mhm.
What was it like?
Yeah, no, it was amazing. I've been a fan of Daniel's work for a long time. His most recent book that he did, called Cemetery Kids Don't Die, I think he did an amazing job on that. He's been doing an amazing job for years. But yeah, it was super easy to, it was a very short list of artists that I thought would potentially work for this book, and he was right at the top of it. So you know, it's been awesome working with him. He is Puerto Rican, lives on the island, born and raised. Many of the moments in this book, like Hurricane Maria, he obviously experienced, and he brings that experience to the page. You know, and I see it in his conversations with the colorist, Patricio. Little things that you might miss if, maybe you weren't researched or you didn't experience it firsthand. But Hurricane Maria hit at
Mhm.
like 6 a.m., right? So the sun was out. It wasn't a dark storm, and that's why in the opening pages of the book, it's light out. It's a little gray, but the ocean water is not black. The ocean water is still,
Mhm.
the way that he drew the book and the notes that he gave the colorist were to make it look like Puerto Rico, and
Mhm.
to make it, feel lived in. And there's so many little things that he puts throughout the book. Our second issue, you can see a little bit on the cover of it. One of our big scenes in the second issue takes place in a botanica, and it's
Mhm.
Loli and her friend Blanca. They go to see this woman, a santera, and they, come to talk to her to try to get information about what is this creature that they experienced, that they saw. And so much of it, goes into that history of the 3 cultures, of the Spaniards, obviously, who invaded, of the indigenous Taino culture, and the African culture of the enslaved people. And there's so much into the lore that we created for the Chupacabra, because the truth is that the Chupacabra doesn't really have much lore the way that other cryptids
Mhm.
do, aside from like the sightings and the history of it. Like, there isn't a story about like where did he come from,
Yeah.
what's the Chupacabra's history. And that's something that we took a lot of, Puerto Rican history, and we sort of built that out a bit. and it's something that I'm really proud of, and that so much of it comes from, you know, Puerto Rican history and so much of what Daniel put into the art. It's just been an amazing, amazing collaboration. And I
Yeah.
love, you know, this is his first time being colored by an outside colorist. And I hope that he keeps working with Patricio because they're a perfect combination.
So I wanted to also talk about the other work that you've been able to kind of establish yourself, not only as a writer and a creative, but also someone who is, like you said, you're passionate about the social justice pieces of the work. But I wanted to highlight your work and how you have kind of like established. You talked about home. Do you want to talk a little about
Mhm.
home, where people can find it, if they can find trade paperbacks, so on and so forth?
Yeah,
And
yeah. So Home is, it was a 5-issue miniseries initially, and now it's, obviously collected in trade as a graphic novel. But it is the story of this boy named Juan. He and his mom have traveled all the way from Guatemala to McAllen, Texas, to seek asylum at the border. But they happen to, be unlucky, and they show up at the time that the 2018 family separation crisis has just been instituted. And it's also at the same time that Juan is discovering these emerging superpowers.
mm,
Um, and so this is a story really about Juan coming to terms with his superpowers. It's a coming of age story in that sense. But it's also a story about assimilation, about the ideas of should we hide our powers and protect ourselves, or do we have a responsibility to help other people? And this is all happening while, as you can imagine, like a 12-year-old, Guatemalan kid who's an seeking asylum, breaks out of prison accidentally breaks out of prison because of his superpowers. The whole weight of the federal government comes down on him as he's trying to be reunited with his mom. Um, and this, obviously, this is the book that started my career. The trade paperback is available wherever you get books. It also has in the back of it, which I think is really important, a 25-page teacher's guide,
mm,
because this book is being used in classrooms all over the country at
amazing.
all grade levels. I have it's a kind of surreal experience to be a community college dropout that has one of your books, people are writing dissertations about it, and you're learning things about your own book by reading the dissertation. um, but
That's so cool.
it's something that's been used in, from fifth grade classrooms all the way, obviously, as I said, to the graduate level. So that's a really important book to me. But yeah, I'm
That's
really proud
awesome.
of it.
And this was published out of Image. So what was
Mhm.
that like when you pitched it and when you said, "Hey, this is my idea. I think this would be a great book." What was their response? And maybe if you could kind of frame the timing of it.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the short version, because I mentioned I started making, I got into trying to figure out how to write comics and break into the industry because I had the idea for this book, and I wanted to make this book. It was all in service of this book. But in the meantime, I started doing short stories to sort of just like build up my chops and everything, like I was talking about before. But at the same time, I was developing the proposal for this. So, just to go back to like what we were talking about, like, being a Latino working in comics. Which I don't really, it might sound strange to hear this, but, like, I don't really view myself as, like, a quote unquote "Latino" in comics, I am a person that is making things that are very personal to me and that
Mhm.
are about issues that I'm passionate about. Um, I don't think that, obviously my experience as a Latino in this country and growing up in a place like Miami obviously shapes all of that, but I think these are all universal issues,
Agreed.
But anyway, I started developing this pitch, and Alex Segura, who's a good friend of mine now, he had a class, an online class that he was teaching about how to develop a proposal for a comic book. Um, and because of him, another Miami Cuban American guy who I did not know at the time, who was making his way through comics, I learned how to make a proposal for this book. And then I go to New York Comic Con 2019. This is my first ever Comic Con. But I go there with a very specific plan, which is I have a list of editors that I've, sort of from being on Twitter back when Twitter was like a usable platform, from looking into like, oh, I like this book and this is the editor listed inside. Um, and my mission essentially is to go to all these publishers' booths, go on Google Images on my phone, look up their photos, and try to find them at the booth, and then cold pitch them on my book, you know?
Wow.
Um, and I did that, I did that at IDW, at Vault, at Dark Horse, at Boom, at every publisher, and it was honestly a very humiliating experience, because a lot of them were not interested, or none of them were interested,
Yeah.
um, in this book from a person that they didn't know, just to like, benefit of the doubt. They didn't know me. I was coming up to them and I had an iPad with a PDF of my pitch, trying to pitch them on this book about, this immigrant kid with superpowers a year after the events, or, while the events were still going on in a sense of
Hmm.
separation. So it is a very like hot political topic that a lot of these publishers don't want to touch, uh,
Yeah.
and I'm no one to them, I'm an unknown quantity. But going back to Latinos in comics, I go up to the image booth. I don't recognize anyone, I'm not seeing anyone on my Google image like faces. So I just go up to this woman that I see there. Her name is Elena Salcedo. And I picture the book. It turns out that she works at Top Cow, which is an imprint of Image. Uh,
Hmm.
and she tells me very rightfully, now I know I wasn't really familiar with Top Cow at the time. And also I didn't approach her as an employee of Top Cow. She was just a person at the booth. She says this isn't a good fit for Top Cow, but I
Hmm.
love this idea. I think it's great. I'm going to put it in front of Image Central. I think Image would be interested in publishing this. And then, maybe 6 months later, I get an email from Eric Stevenson, the publisher of it, the head of Image. And it's a story that I really, not just because it was a Latina who like, r- you know, essentially opened the door for me. But I just found, we didn't really keep in touch, but I found out late last year that she actually passed away,
Hmm.
last year. And you know, I if it wasn't for her being the person that I, happened to talk, I could have, there was like 10 people at that booth. I could have
Hmm.
chosen one of the other ones, and they could have just told me like, "Oh no, the Image doesn't really have editors. We don't really work like that. I'm just hired here to sell, Walking Dead t-shirts or whatever." But for some reason, I went to her, maybe because she was a Latina and I felt, maybe a little more comfortable talking to her. But I went to her and she opened the door for me, you know.
Wow.
Um, and then my book got published by the biggest creator-owned publisher in comics, which I had no, I that was the last booth that I went up to that day. Um,
Really?
yeah,
Wow.
and I was already, feeling like this is going horribly.
Yeah.
My wife is watching all of this happen.
She's like, "Are you sure you want to do this?"
Yeah, and she's been super. She's like the person that encouraged me from the beginning.
Awesome.
It's like, oh, you read all these comics, like why don't you try writing one of them? And like she's watching me like try to talk to these people and just like humiliation, um, but then, Elena cracked the door open for me,
Yeah.
and then my book, which I never had the expectation that it would be published by Image, but I'm there. I paid all this money to go into New York Comic Con. I might as well go try to talk to someone there, so yeah. I don't remember what your question was, but I think it was about how did I get to Image? But yeah, so
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
leads to everything else, so
Yeah.
I owe her so much. I wish, I did get to thank her afterwards, but, I don't, we didn't keep in touch. I hope that she did see, the other books that I kept doing. Um, and, I wish I could thank her again.
I also wanted to talk about these books, Frontera
Mhm.
and Si Se Puede. I love that you are pushing the envelope and pushing these historical connections here. But you want to talk about Frontera and Si Se Puede?
Yeah, so Frontera is a supernatural border adventure story. It was published by HarperCollins. It's a young adult graphic novel. And but I like I said, I write all these books for myself, so like young adult is technically like 13 to 17 is the target audience. But I wrote it for me, so that's not to say that if you're an adult you can't read it. But yeah, it is the story of this boy named Mateo. He's recently deported his fam back to Mexico. His family's just raised enough money to fund a coyote to take him across the border back to Arizona, where he's set to start his new year of school and get back to, all of his goals that he has back home in Arizona. He was raised in the US his whole life, didn't even know he was undocumented until
Wow.
the deportation. But along the way, he's a 16-year-old hard-headed kid, thinks he knows better than everyone else. And the coyote, who's also a kid, um, tells him like, it's not the right time. We can't cross right now. It's too hot. Like
Mm,
not temperature also, but like there's too much border patrol. But he's impatient. He needs to get to his first day of school. He needs to be there. So he decides to just go on his own. And obviously he runs into trouble in this vast Sonoran desert, between Mexico and Phoenix, where he's trying to get to. But luckily, along the way, he meets this ghost named Guillermo. And Guillermo is a migrant that died in that same desert over 100 years ago, who has
wow.
seen the way that the border has evolved over the last 100 years, the way it's become more militarized, it's become more dangerous. And he has been in this state of limbo all this time. And he's seen people died. He's tried to help people, help some of them in vain. And now he takes Mateo on, and they go on this adventure together
Mm,
from, on his way to Phoenix. And then Si Se Puede is very different. It's a nonfiction graphic novel about important Latinos throughout US history, all the way from kind of what we talked about, like the harvest of empire of it all, the thesis that Juan puts in that book that you can trace most Latin American migration to the United States. You can trace it to intervention in those countries and U.S. colonization and imperialism. So we kind of start with that. That's our first chapter, kind of explaining like why are we here. Um, and then, despite all of these horrible things that I kind of describe, these are all the triumphs that we've had. From the American Civil War, where I didn't know this until I started researching the book, but you know, thousands of Latinos fought for for the Union
mhm.
against the Confederacy and for the abolition of slavery in the U.S. Civil War. And we talk about, for I'll give just one quick example. This Cuban American guy named Federico Fernandez Cavada, who, obviously a civil war is a time before the airplane had been invented, but they still had aerial reconnaissance. And what they did was they had hot air balloons. And he was a guy who was a cartographer, and he would go up in a hot air balloon and draw maps of where the Confederates were and send it
Wow.
down so that, the soldiers on the ground could fight the Confederates. And this was a Cuban guy,
That's
Um,
awesome.
and so it goes from the U.S. Civil War all the way to modern day. People you might recognize like Dolores Huerta, Roberto Clemente,
Mhm.
but also people like Ellen Ochoa, the first Latina to go to space. A chemist who discovered that the hole in the ozone layer was man-made, a Mexican American. So it's a book that again I wish I had when I was a kid. Even though I grew up in Miami, all my teachers were Latinas. I didn't learn about any of these people. I didn't learn about the farm workers movement. I didn't learn about the Young Lords. We have a most of the book is separated into chapters about different subjects, but at the end of every chapter, we have like these one-page biographies about like other figures, and one of them is actually Felipe Luciano. We have a
Cool.
one-page sort of biography on him in it. But yeah, so these were all of these graphic novels that I publish are with traditional book publishers. So Frontera is published by HarperCollins. Si Se Puede is published by Penguin Random House, who is one of my main publishers. But yeah, so it's a totally different world, totally different audience.
Yeah.
But graphic novels are obviously exploding amongst, young adults and middle grade readers. So it's just another avenue for me to tell stories in a graphic novel format, um, and to, tell stories for younger readers, as well as obviously with a story like Bisa Borikén that's, a horror book for adults.
For people real quick that want to get in touch with you, how can they find your socials, connect with you, so on and so
Yeah.
forth?
My website is julioanta.com. I am at Julio Anta on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. Yeah, wherever, you can find me. It's just my name. There's
Awesome.
not a
And
lot
make
of
sure
Julio
you get the
Antas.
books. Make sure you do the
Yeah, yeah.
FOCs, the pre-orders, everything.
Pick up
Support.
the books. Piece of Borikén hits stores July 1st. Uh, June 9th, I have my next middle grade graphic novel. It is called, let me move my Godzilla here and get, so this is Skull Goes for Goal. It
Yep.
is the sequel to my bilingual Speak Up Santiago. So
Amazing.
that's out June 9th. And then throughout the summer, I have a bunch of short stories for places like EC Comics, Hello Darkness at Boom. Issue 3 of Bisa Borikén has a short story that I wrote also. And then in the fall, I'm gonna have a series at Boom Studios that'll be announced probably in the next few weeks. And one more graphic novel called Second Generation Blues, September 29th, I believe. That's a young adult graphic novel.
You sure you have enough on your plate?
No, I need more. I need one more book.
All right, everybody. Anybody out there that's looking to be inspired, please make sure you not only support, but that you are also touching back. Part of this relationship that we have in this community is, again, as illustrated by Julio, someone was able to support and pull him up into spaces needed. So, and he's doing that for us right here, right now. Julio, gracias por todo. I
No,
appreciate you
gracias
so
a ti,
much
un
for all that
placer.
you do.
Thank you.
And everybody, this is Julio Anta, and make sure that you pick up the book, Beast of Borinken. And I am your host, Gen X, and I'll be back with the next episode very soon. And we thank you all for supporting us. Remember, like, subscribe, and share on YouTube. And we are out.